Dear Rector Gavarov, colleagues from the Institute of Psychology and Education and from the wider university, distinguished guests, dear delegates, I'm very pleased to be here with you again virtually at the 7th International Forum for Teacher Education and congratulate all of those involved in planning another superb conference on teacher education. But before I start, I'd like to offer my sincere condolences to all of those affected by the tragic events that took place at School 175 on the 18th of May. My thoughts are with you, as are those of my colleagues at Oxford who have visited your great city. And we hope you will recover from the terrible shock and rebuild the lives of those affected. My title today is Teacher Education Research, Values-Based Planning in an Uncertain World, which seems all too topical. The global significance of teacher education has never been greater than it is today. In this world where migration, inequality, climate change, political upheavals and strife continue to be manifest in many locations, governments and scholars alike are increasingly considering what role education systems can play in achieving stability and managed sustainable economic development. With growing awareness that the quality of education is closely related to the quality of teachers and teaching, teacher education has moved into a key strategic position in international debate and discussion. And this proposition is as true and pertinent in the global South and East as it is in the Northern and Western worlds. All of these concerns have been amplified by the impact of the global viral pandemic. There are many moral challenges to be faced by teacher educators, policymakers, and researchers. In previous presentations at IFTI, I have talked about the connections between research and teacher education and have referred to the BIRA RSA report from 2014. In 2018, I spoke about the vernacular globalization effects that are evident in looking across teacher education systems in 12 different national settings. Then, in 2019, I focused on Russia and England and offered some comparative reflections on politics and teacher education. Last year, I spoke about the 21 systems that make up Central and Eastern Europe and suggested 8 themes that emerged from a consideration of how their approaches to teacher education are responding to the challenges and opportunities created by the process of democratization. I'm now delighted to report that at the end of January this year, in the midst of the pandemic and in England, our 3rd lockdown, I was able to submit the text of an edited collection on teacher education in Russia. We expect this book to be published by Routledge in August of this year. It is the outcome of the continuing collaboration with my dear colleagues at KFU, in particular Ilshat Gavarov, Aidar Kalimulin, and Rosa Valieva. It also includes a chapter by Elena Revyakina based on her doctoral study undertaken at University College Dublin. Towards the end of today's presentation, I'll be drawing on work that will be included in that book. In this talk today, I want to highlight the importance of values in teacher education. I start by exploring, again, the relations between teacher education and research and seek to draw out the values dimensions in these relationships. This leads to a discussion about the connections between teacher education research and professionalism in teaching. I then turn to consider how teacher education has been developing in such an extraordinary way at KFU over the past 10 years and suggest a number of underlying values that have informed these developments. In conclusion, I suggest a number of questions that may be important to all of us as teacher educators and as researchers as we move forward, we hope, into a healthier and more stable future. Now, to pick up the theme of research and teacher education, in an earlier article, I discussed different relationships between teacher education and research. I suggested three particular relationships: research in teacher education, research on teacher education, and research around teacher education. So firstly, research in teacher education. This, the most common approach to teacher education research, remains very important. If teaching itself is viewed as an inquiry-based profession, then it is important that teacher educators model an inquiry approach in their own work. In the major inquiry into the relationship between teacher education and research carried out in 2013-14 by the British Educational Research Association in partnership with the Royal Society for the Arts, the model of teaching and teacher education that emerged as the most productive is one that is indeed inquiry-based. The report from that inquiry called for all teachers to be research literate. That is, all teachers should be equipped with the appropriate skills to evaluate educational research and also with the capacity to engage in inquiry themselves. The implications of this requirement are that all teacher education programs should seek to provide trained teachers with these qualities. The idea of teacher as researcher has a long tradition, not least in the UK, where that phrase was coined by Lawrence Stenhouse back in the 1970s. He saw teachers as curriculum researchers. However, Stenhouse, like many of those who followed in that tradition, believed that teacher research must be rigorous. One of the common criticisms of much teacher research is that it is not only small scale, but also that it can tend to be unsystematic and therefore of poor quality. The second relationship is research on teacher education. This is research that steps back from practice and seeks to analyze and understand teacher education in a more detached way. This is still all too scarce. Very often, such research is carried out by policy researchers who are interested in how programs are developed and in their effects. This approach to research can be very revealing of policymakers' motives and values and may well challenge current assumptions. More of this kind of research is needed. It should be theoretically informed and should include work that is both large-scale and longitudinal and that uses a full range of methods. One recent example is the Studying the Effectiveness of Teacher Education study carried out in Australia by a large consortium of researchers from several different institutions led by Diane Mayer. Some comparative education studies of teacher education also may be seen as good examples of research on teacher education. The Home International Study of Teacher Education Policy and Practice in the UK and Ireland, shown there on your right, is an example. It is very valuable to contrast and compare approaches, not least in neighbouring jurisdictions, in order to identify how different values and understandings of teaching may lead to very different approaches to teacher education. And then thirdly, we have research around teacher education. If research on teacher education is relatively scarce, then research around teacher education is even scarcer. If it is agreed that approaches to teacher education have a deep symbolic significance culturally and sociologically in any social system, as I have often argued, then this dearth of theoretically well-informed and often interdisciplinary work is not only surprising, but a matter of concern. Research around teacher education means research that seeks to understand teacher education in a broader context, for example, taking historical, anthropological, political science, or social theory perspectives. Such work is likely to be essentially interdisciplinary and is designed to explore the relationships between teacher education and the wider society. In the UK, a good example of this would be my colleague John Furlong's study shown here, which steps well outside the usual constraints of the study of teacher education by looking at the institutional and societal setting of teacher education during the 20th and into the 21st centuries. This creates a set of significantly deeper insights than are achieved in much teacher education research that simply regards teacher education as a self-contained system. I would also suggest that with its strong socio-historical perspective, our forthcoming book on teacher education in Russia demonstrates elements of research around teacher education as well as research on teacher education. So, to summarize what I've said so far, one characteristic of teacher education research is that much of it is conducted by those who are also its practitioners, whether as teacher educators or as managers. In all three of the relationships I have outlined, we can see how important values are in undertaking research. There are values underlying the conceptions of the research, the framing of the questions to be investigated, and also the methods to be adopted in undertaking the study. It has long been my contention that teacher educators as a professional community collectively manifest a deep commitment to humanistic values, including profound respect, empathy, commitment to socially just approaches, and to the betterment of society, including children and young people, tomorrow's citizens. So, whatever the particular focus of the research, we may be confident that it will be informed by such values and that the way in which it is conducted will demonstrate these commitments. Whether the methodologies deployed are quantitative or qualitative, large scale or small scale, psychological, philosophical or sociological, we can expect that care will be taken to ensure that the rights of those involved in the work will be protected and that the overall purpose of the research is some form of improvement. This improvement may be in policy and or practice, as may be expected from research in or on teacher education. However, it may also be seeking improvement in our understanding, including our theoretical understanding of teacher education, especially in the outcomes of research around teacher education. In broad terms, then, these reflections point to some of the ethical dimensions of teacher education research. In my own work, including that which I have been undertaking with my colleagues in Kazan, I have always aspired to maintain principles such as these. In taking a broadly sociological approach to the study of teacher education, working with colleagues, collaboration and joint development of projects have been crucial. In addition to the sociological dimension, the work has sought to recognize the significance of history and culture, thus the terms socio-historical and socio-cultural have been important. Certainly in our forthcoming book on teacher education in Russia, the socio-historical viewpoint has been the dominant one, which we have adopted in trying to make sense of the past, present and future of policy and practice in Russia. And in my collaborations with Maria Teresa Tato, as well as taking cognizance of the historical dimension, we have also been seeking to develop the cultural dimension. Our collaborations for the WERA IRN work, shown on the left of those two books on the right, and in our two-nation study of policy and practice in teacher education in England and the United States, we've sought to develop a distinctive methodological framework which draws on Vygotskian theory as well as the sociology of Basil Bernstein. The approach is also informed by an ecological perspective, acknowledging the important interaction of processes at different levels, usually referred to as the macro, meso, and micro. So, in the first part of this talk, I hope I have established the significance of values in underlying and informing teacher education research, whatever its particular form. Now, I want to try to link this with a wider conception of teaching and professionalism in education. And here I draw on work undertaken last year by me with our colleague Maria Flores. The importance for all beginning and early career teachers to become research literate and to be provided with opportunities for engagement in research and inquiry has been consistently advocated, as we heard earlier. However, the place of research in teacher education continues to be contested and is seen by some as controversial. For instance, the emergence of an inquiry-based culture in the practicum was seen as both innovative and controversial. It incorporated tensions and challenges in regard to visions of teacher education, as well as mismatches between curriculum rhetoric and implementation. As Maria Flores and her colleagues have noted in the Portuguese context, the integration of an inquiry-based approach to teaching in teacher education faces a number of challenges. First of all, inquiry demands time, and the condensation of initial teacher education into a 2-year master's program, that represented a reduction of time allocated to school-based practice, with implications for the opportunity to engage in pedagogical inquiry. Along with this is the risk of making the practicum more academic and less profession-oriented, for instance, by conceiving practicum reports as theoretical monographs or descriptions of empirical research unrelated to pedagogical action. Marilyn Cochrane-Smith, several years ago, talked about inquiry as stance in teaching and teacher education. This, I suggest, is in essence a value position. It has implications for teaching and teacher education, for policy and practice in both. Now, I said I would say something about Kazan Federal University, taking it as a case. Here at KFU, there is a deep commitment to developing a research-based model of teacher education, and now drawing on the relevant chapter in our forthcoming book, written by Gavarov and Kalimulin, I wish to consider this case. The merger of 7 higher education institutions and the creation of KFU in 2010 created the 3rd largest teacher education center in the Russian Federation. Given that 2 of the 7 institutions were pedagogical universities, it's no surprise that the potential for significant development in the field of teacher education was there from the start. However, it took a great deal of moral and professional courage to establish teacher education as a key focus of strategic development, given the competition from other important areas, including medicine, information technology, and earth sciences. In the decade that has passed since these mergers, we have not only seen the quantitative growth of teacher education at KFU, we have also seen the creation of a distinctive, indeed unique approach to teacher education. KFU has indubitably become a centre of excellence for teacher education. It's important, though, to stress that the success of the emerging approach at KFU does draw on great traditions across the predecessor institutions, and there's much more detail on that in the chapter I referred to. Furthermore, such progress would not have been achieved without the considerable backing of resources provided by federal programs, such as the Programme of Development of Federal Universities, and most importantly, the Russian Academic Excellence Project 5 to 100. We might single out 4 particular factors at KFU for comment. When we consider all 4 of these in combination, I suggest it begins to come clear why KFU has made such a distinctive contribution, not only regionally, but in the context of the wider Russian Federation. And it reveals the values which inform this approach. First has been the significance attached to subject expertise. The collaboration between the Institute of Psychology and Education, with other faculties across the university has been a key element in the development of enormous strength in the preparation of subject specialist teachers. In this, I'm reminded of the Donaldson Review of Teacher Education in Scotland, which I've referred to before, in which he called for much wider involvement of a range of university departments in teacher education. Second, we have seen how the relationships with schools in the region have progressed. The importance of effective partnerships in successful teacher education has been stressed by scholars around the world for many years now. At Oxford, we saw the creation of the Education Deanery as the way forward, or in the USA, the model of professional development schools. KFU's relationships with schools where beginning teachers undertake their practicum may be seen as a parallel development. Furthermore, the creation of KFU's own schools, the Lobachevsky Grammar School with a focus on physics and mathematics, the IT Boarding Grammar School, and a secondary school under the patronage of the Elabuga Institute of KFU. And we also see the creation of a kindergarten specializing in provision for children with autism spectrum disorder. All of these are sites of exemplary teacher education practice. Third, the recognition of the significance of the lifelong continuum of professional learning is demonstrated in the commitment to the provision of continuing professional development opportunities for teachers across the wider Volga region. The connections between initial, induction, and in-service training, what were called the 3 I's in Northern Ireland, are more important today than they have ever been as our societies change and develop ever more rapidly. Fourthly and finally, I draw attention to the importance that is attached at KFU to a research orientation in the approach to teacher education. Earlier in the talk, I referred to the 3 key relationships between research and teacher education. It's clear to me that all 3 of these have a strong place in KFU's understanding of how the highest quality may be achieved in the creation of new teachers and in the support of serving teachers. In the BERA RSA report from 2014, there was this model of the teacher that emphasized 3 dimensions. In my view, what is happening at KFU reflects this kind of understanding of teaching and teacher education. It is a fundamentally research literate approach, very much aligned with the model of teacher professionalism spelled out in the BERA RSA report. Given these 4 commitments and given the quality, skills and expertise that have underpinned the developments here at KFU, at all levels in the university and across all faculties, it is no surprise to me to see how KFU has rapidly risen through the international quality rankings in its provision in the field of education. I could also have referred to other aspects of the infrastructure that has been developed at KFU to support this work, such as the Centre of Master's Studies, the Engelhardt Astronomical Observatory and Planetarium, as well as the provision of cutting-edge information technology. However, each of the 4 elements that I have chosen to draw attention to that are manifested in the KFU approach to teacher education demonstrates a commitment to a particular value base, including subject knowledge, partnership, lifelong learning, and research. However, before concluding, I would want to suggest that underlying those particular values applied to teacher education is a broader set of values, a set of universal human values which imbues the approach at KFU. This set of values includes deep respect for human life. This applies to children, their families, to colleagues, and the wider professional community. It also includes a recognition of difference and the need to respond positively and creatively to difference, and the need, for example, in relation to ethnicity, language, and culture, as well as differences in intellectual and physical capacities. And finally, I would suggest that these values of respect for humanity and for celebrating difference demonstrate the commitment to social justice and to developing a socially just approach to education generally and teacher education in particular. So to conclude, we have seen how the relationships between teaching, teacher professionalism, teacher education, and educational research have been developing in many contexts over recent years, including here at KFU. It is my contention that these relationships can now provide key indicators for the evaluation of the condition of teaching and teacher education in any particular context. I wish to conclude, again drawing on my paper with Maria Flores, by offering a series of questions which might be used as the basis for such an evaluation. First, how is teacher professionalism defined and by whom? Second, what is the nature of the relationships between the respective communities of policy, practice and research in teaching? Third, to what extent is an inquiry approach embedded within ITE, teacher induction and continuing professional development? And fourthly, who undertakes research into teaching and teacher education, and what is its nature? Is a broad range of research methodologies employed? Is there evidence of independence and criticality in the research undertaken? How is the research disseminated and made use of? If we can pursue answers to questions such as these within a particular context, we may then be able to offer an assessment of the state of health of the profession of teaching in that context. It is certainly not intended that such an approach will be in any way constraining. Indeed, we would expect to see great variation between the approaches taken in different settings relating to the national specificities of the context, including historical trajectories and distinctive cultural characteristics. As I argued here 2 years ago, the forces of globalization have led to a certain degree of convergence, at least in educational policy, if less so in educational practice, leading, in other words, to forms of vernacular globalization. In a world where education is still mainly organized at a national level, albeit with some regional elements, such as in the European Union, it is desirable that such diversity continues. It is through comparative analysis that we may come to understand better both our own approaches and the approaches taken by others. The second important rider to my conclusion is to remind ourselves of the dynamic and diachronic nature of teaching as a profession and of the interactions between research, policy and practice. The years 2020 and 2021 have shown dramatically how events can change expectations and experiences. We should remember that teaching is a profession concerned not only with knowledge and cognition, crucial though these are, but also with values and morality. It is challenges such as these that require a full recognition of the need to imbue teaching and teacher education with a sustainable inquiry orientation, indeed a base in education research. Through such an orientation, teachers may be in a much stronger position to respond positively to the challenges they face on a day-to-day basis, but also to take a continually developing approach to their own capacity and skills over the duration of their careers. This, I suggest, must be the basis of contemporary teacher professionalism and should shape our approaches to all aspects of teacher education. Thank you very much for listening to me. I will make the slides available via the IFTI website, and the final slide has in print, you probably can't read, all the references I've used, and I hope we can have an interesting discussion about some of the points I have raised. Thank you very much for listening.